Good evening, everyone. Welcome. I'm Gary Hilderbrand, the Peter Lewis Hornbeck Professor in Practice and the Chair of the Department of Landscape Architecture. It's my honor to welcome you to the annual Daniel Urban Kiley Lecture given this year by our dear friend Beth Meyer. I'll begin by acknowledging that Harvard Graduate School of Design is located on the traditional and ancestral land of the Massachusetts, the original inhabitants of what is now known as Boston and Cambridge. We pay respect to the people of the Massachusetts tribe, past, present, and future, and honor the land itself, which remains sacred to them. The school also recognizes the work of the Harvard University Native American program in cultivating the relationships that led to the creation of the land acknowledgement. Quick reminder that we have live captioning available tonight for our virtual audience, even those who are up on the trays watching. To enable captions, just click the closed captioning button at the bottom of the live stream window. I want to thank Raquel, Han, and Brian for their, and the entire event staff who always manage to produce a good event. And then I also want to invite you to join us for an upcoming program next Thursday, March 5th. Daniel Fernandez Pascual will present his Wheelwright Prize lecture entitled Being Shellfish, Architectures of Intertidal Cohabitation. Should be good. Now for tonight's event. Tonight's lecture honors Daniel Urban Kiley, who enrolled in the GSD in 1935 and became one of the world's most respected and influential landscape architects. An anonymous donor established the Kiley Lecture at the GSD in 1984, and ever since it's been an important event in our department's public programs. Kiley's importance to the field is evident throughout the GSD. The Kiley Archive is part of the Loeb Library Special Collections, a vast archive. The Kiley Exhibition Fund was created by friends, clients, and protégés to support landscape architecture exhibitions. And the Kiley Teaching Fellow Program supports faculty recruitment and development. We're joined tonight by our current Kiley Fellow, Kira Klingen. A few years ago, the library received the late Aaron Kiley's vast and really great collection of photographs of his father's work. So we're honored to have these enduring tributes, including tonight's lecture, to the Kiley family and their relationship to GSD. So what a great honor it is to introduce Beth Meyer, who's no stranger to the GSD. She taught here from 1988 to 1992, and she's currently a prominent voice on the school's visiting committee. And I'm personally grateful to Beth for being a great advocate for the department in discussions of important matters in those meetings, school-wide and beyond. Beth is one of the most widely read and frequently cited scholars of American landscape architecture. It's no exaggeration to say she's been as influential as any scholar of her generation in delineating history, theory, and criticism as a set of practices that must be grounded in the physical materiality and experience of sites. And it's important to note that this influence extends beyond a community of scholars and thinkers because of her own deep and continuous experience and practice. Beth's work reaches a broad community of academics and practitioners alike. Those who work in theory aren't always able to make that claim, but we know that to be the case here. Beth has served as department chair and dean of the School of Architecture at the University of Virginia, where she is the Merrill D. Peterson Professor of Landscape Architecture and the faculty director of the Morven Sustainability Lab, and we'll come back to that in a little bit. Her roots and practice have surely shaped her scholarly work. She first worked with Michael Ferguson in 1989 and 91, and then at IDA in Alexandria from 1983. Sorry, I got these dates wrong. 1983 to 1987. While at IDA, Beth was the primary author of a study of the University of Virginia historic central grounds. That was like career making. This work rather immediately became a reference for what we know now as cultural landscape studies. It didn't exist then. So there was really no precedent for that work at the time. I have a copy. It has a really broken spine because I've used it a lot. Hand-drawn diagrams and all of that. Beth spent 2 years at Hannah Olin, the predecessor firm to Olin, working primarily on the highly acclaimed renovation of Bryant Park. What a great project that is. After moving into teaching, she continued to do consulting work with Michael Van Valkenburg Associates and others on sites including the U.S. National Zoo, the George Washington Parkway, Wellesley College campus, UVA Central Grounds, the St. Louis Gateway Arch project, and the White House grounds, working with Michelle Obama to create a garden to grow vegetables. Recognitions are numerous. She was appointed by President Barack Obama to the U.S. Commission of Fine Arts, notably during a time when the pressure to continue to approve new memorials was mounting, even though Congress had already declared that the monumental core was a completed work of art. Weird irony there. She's been a senior fellow in Garden and Landscape Studies at Dumbarton Oaks at Harvard, and she was awarded the Vincent Scully Prize for exemplary achievements in the environment from the National Building Museum in 2019. Last year, Beth was recognized with the Thomas Jefferson Award, which is UVA's most prestigious faculty honor. So as I've said, Beth's impact on the discipline, and I should say in allied professions as well, has been massive through some very influential essays that reverberate with a unique and consistent voice. That voice is a joy to read. In her first sole authored paper in 1991, while she was an assistant professor here, Beth published The Public Park as Avant-Garde Landscape Architecture, a comparative interpretation of two Parisian parks, Parc de la Villette from 1983 to 1990 and Parc de Bouchemont, 1864 to 1887. Her reading in this paper of Bernard Tschumy's Parc de la Villette through the lens of an analysis of the Bouchemont, Alphonse's 19th century masterpiece, which revealed with great expressiveness its own troubled histories, made the case for a reading of both projects as building from a system of superimposed layers. But while similarities exist between these two, she very deftly destroyed Tschumy's polemical claim of avant-gardism, wherein he states that the La Villette Park amounts to a rejection of the Olmsted Park, precisely because his text exhibits almost no knowledge of the history he claimed to reject. Her larger claim, though, was that ignorance of history is a peril to avoid if we're to expand our boundaries and invent new imaginary landscapes. In the following year, 1992, Beth published a paper entitled Situating Modern Landscape Architecture, Theory as a Building, Mediating, and Reconciling Practice. She presented this paper at a CELA conference at a time when a small but very energetic, determined scholars, including Kenny Helfand, the young James Corner, Hamid Shirvani, Bob Riley, Maggie McGavin, John Dixon Hunt, and Beth, were making valiant attempts to raise a discourse through the close reading of built works and through theories that could emerge from those close readings. It was a kind of agitated, warm front that brought with it a new kind of weather, and it worked. That paper asked, how could design theory enrich contemporary landscape architecture practice? In what ways have treatises, theoretical frameworks, and contiguous physical contexts informed the work of landscape designers? Such a vital question in the 90s, and we built this literature from it. We discussed this in a class today. How do built landscapes embody and embed these ideas, values, and settings within their forms and spaces? This work was also the basis for a new course at the GSD called Theories of Landscape Architecture Design, open to students in all of the disciplines here. That course defined theory as a bridging, mediating, and reconciling practice within the field of landscape architecture and within the time frames known as modern. I recall this course syllabus turning up many places beyond GSD. We would now call it viral. Most of these being faint traces and some downright plagiarizing of what was truly a groundbreaking course. Beth's next papers were also heavily cited, and this is after she had moved to the University of Virginia to chair that program. The expanded field of landscape architecture in 1997, seized by sublime sentiments between terra firma and terra incognito, which in a symposium in this room in 1998 cast Richard Haig's Gasworks Park as an exemplar of the technological sublime, Beth's own coinage, but now a familiar category. 2 years later, the post-Earth Day conundrum, environmental values into landscape design. And probably the most influential work of that period was in 2008, a paper called Sustaining Beauty, the Performance of Appearance, a manifesto in 3 parts. And a couple of years later, a follow-up work, Beyond Sustaining Beauty, Musings on a Manifesto, which addressed and reacted to reactions to the first essay of that title. Her 2008 formulation of the issues of our time, as expressed in works of landscape architecture, was prescient. Because a decade and a half later, we could identify the very same issues as urgent matters for our field. Beth herself has said this was the least scholarly of her works, but the most impactful. And like I said, it's a wonderful voice to read. So let me just quote. Sustainable landscape design is generally understood in relation to 3 principles: ecological health, social justice, and economic prosperity. Continuing a little bit later, this article examines the role of beauty and aesthetics in a sustainability agenda. Nobody had said that before. It argues that it will take more than ecologically regenerative designs, which we were seeing lots of, for culture to be sustainable. That what's needed are designed landscapes that provoke those who experience them to become more aware of how their actions affect the environment, and to care enough to make changes. This involves considering the role of aesthetic environmental experiences, such as beauty, in recentering human consciousness from an egocentric to a more biocentric perspective. I could read that all again. That's pretty riveting. But tonight, we're going to hear about Beth's latest work, which brings together complicated narratives of history with ecological imperatives and conservation measures on the 3,000-acre Morven farm, a multidisciplinary experimental library where ideas can be tested and evaluated. That's timely for us as we are committing to greater access to and use of Harvard's land resources here in Boston for our students in future years. And let me end on a personal note. In 1989, when I was asked to join the faculty as a visiting critic, the last-minute call, I need help. I know what that feels like. You do too. I had the very good fortune of teaching alongside Beth Meyer for 3 years. We taught core studios together, sometimes even both fall and spring, which I would not advise. Wouldn't propose that today, but we were a good team. I'm a firm believer in the need for young teachers to have active and caring mentors, and that is part of my job as a senior member of the faculty and currently as the chair of a department that has so many promising teachers, many of them in the room here tonight. I had that kind of mentoring with Beth Meyer, and I'm really grateful for it. And I know it helped me to be a good teacher. So please welcome a great teacher.
It is really a joyful thing to be here and see so many familiar faces, and I hope after this some new ones as you reach out to me. This talk is going to be very different from most of the lectures I've given in my life, in that it's really about a place and starting a new program and a new institution, the Morven Sustainability Lab. But I want to frame it within the context of land labs writ large and the context of sustainability as a concept. Can everybody hear me okay? Yep, okay. I heard you to push hard. Aha. All right. So my conception of land labs was radically altered about 8 years ago when I traveled to Sweden for a symposium. And during the event, a group of us toured the SLU Alnarp campus land lab. Most of the participants who were European were familiar with this 37-acre experimental and experiential urban wood or forest. But I had only recently heard about it and was really unprepared for how I felt, seeing the physical forms, learning about 40 years of creative management, and experiencing profound awe at the inventive and caring practices of planting, spacing, pruning, bleaching, pollarding, coppicing, and thinning. It was a significant moment that coalesced several seemingly different parts of my life. First, I had some new colleagues at UVA, a new department chair, Teresa Galli-Izard, visiting professor, Julian Raxworthy, as well as my colleague, Julie Bargman, all of whom were introducing new methods in the field, altering our ecotech courses and our design studio sequences. Our students were observing and recording, measuring, walking, mowing. In fact, Michael's project was at Morven, with sketchbooks, gardening, landscape equipment, and jerry-rigged Arduino data sensing devices. And second, there was this amazing group of graduate students from David Hill and Brian Davis, Kate Hayes, Michael Geffel, Seth Dennison, Bonnie Kate Walker, Kate Jenkins, I could go on, that I was fortunate to teach, many of whom entered grad school after the Great Recession. And they were eager to be change agents, design activists, and to have an alternative kind of practice. Granted, they had a limited sense of what practice really was like in firms, but they were much less materialistic and more new materialists, fascinated with the stuff of landscape, its medium and materials. And in my theories class, as always, they were introducing me to new authors in the environmental humanities like Jane Bennett, Anna Singh, and Timothy Morton. So this community of students and faculty, many of whom shared a fatigue and disillusionment with the excessive amount of time spent in the studio on computers, and a healthy skepticism about the capacity of mapping to capture the nuanced beauty and biodiversity of the world, were invigorating. They were spending time in the actual landscape, devising one-to-one mesocosm experiments related to plant phenology, management, and change. The Land Lab experience, my new colleagues, and the opportunity of visiting Alnarp really brought into focus the reactions and reconsiderations of my own writing about sustainability. So in a short afternoon walk, I reacted to the changing spatial configurations, the material properties and the aesthetic effects of these test plots, especially at their junctions with intense feelings and emotions. And the affectivity of that walk lingered, and in fact is evident in my current desktop image, which has greeted me every morning since 2016. But it also was apparent in a very unexpected career path that I took a year ago when I accepted the position as the inaugural faculty director of the Morven Sustainability Lab. But I get ahead of myself. So why did the Alnarp Land Lab get under my skin in 2016? I'd been asked to imagine a transdisciplinary land lab for UVA in 1997 by President Castine. It was for a large rural property that I couldn't visit, owned by an unnamed person who I couldn't know. And I proposed a place that would bring together scientists and artists, historians, and forest ecologists, designers, planners, environmental lawyers. It was an institution that could be an outdoor classroom, an experimental farm and forest, a social mixer, a visiting scholars retreat center, you name it. I had it in those 2 pages. It was something between, I don't know, Harvard Forest, Dumbarton Oaks, the American Academy in Rome, and the McDowell Art Colony. That proposal sat fallow, but John Kluge did bequeath Morven to UVA based on that description. So over the years, provosts and presidents came and went, and several of us kept nudging the university to unleash Morven's potential as an experimental and experiential living learning lab. Right before I went to Sweden, I was asked by the University Library and the Virginia Garden Club to sponsor a symposium on Morven because the Garden Club had been visiting Morven for 100 years in their annual Garden Week. So I pulled together Manuel Lerdow, who's now helping me with the strategic plan, a plant biologist, Steve Thompson, an archaeologist who's worked at Morven for 3 years, locating the Monacan and pre-Monacan archaeological sites, Carolyn Schuyler, nature therapist who runs a camp for children, and Thomas Waltz, a landscape architect, who'd consulted with UVA on, I don't know, like one of a dozen master plans for Morven that happened between 2000 and when I was hired. And they were all for conference centers, outside research events. At this event, I spoke of the rare opportunity that Morven afforded us to create experimental grounds where the history of the land altered our conceptions of sustainability, as well as our future imaginations of what might be done and learned through field experiments at Morven. We have record of human movement and settlement on this land going back at least 1000 BC, perhaps earlier. So in 2022, as the pandemic lifted, our new president, President Ryan, and Provost Bauckham reviewed a task force study to propose various missions for Morven, and it's 2,900 acres. It's 44 buildings. It's historic gardens, archaeological sites, fields, meadows, hardwood forests, and pine plantations. The university decided to dedicate these rural lands, located 10 miles from the center of grounds, as the Sustainability Lab. And I'm showing the map on the right just to give you a sense of how big Morven is compared to the size, not only of the university, which is the yellowish color, but the entire city of Charlottesville. The orangish is the other big institution in our neighborhood, which is Carter's Mountain, and that's Monticello. So we're located just southeast of town along Carter's Mountain, and it's about a 20-minute drive from the center of campus. So you know a little bit about land labs and why they interest me. So let me explain to you why I was interested in leading an effort to imagine not just a land lab, but I mean, the biggest land labs I've been looking at are like 100 acres, 3,000 acres. All right, so I want to share with you a little bit about the land labs that I know, starting with Alnarp, and then mentioning a few in the United States that are actually being run by UVA alumni. And I could spend the whole lecture on this, so just know I'm going to get you excited about land labs, and you'll have to do a little bit more work on them. But Alnarp, for those of you who haven't been to Sweden, is near Malmö. It's right across the bay from Copenhagen. And it's an agricultural university, and the land lab is located at the heart of a lot of the research fields. In a recent publication about it, Michel Devine, who I think many of you know is an incredibly talented landscape architect dealing with trees as a medium, said that Alnarp is what I have always wanted to do. And he goes on to talk about the variations in texture and density, the dialogue between the geometrical and randomness, the play with time. And I think he's tapping into something incredibly important in the Land Lab at Alnarp. Roland Gustafsson, who founded it in the late 1970s, thought about it as a place for the collaborations between designers, foresters, and ecologists, and a place that was an experiment in experience as well as in ecology and biodiversity. I want to give you a sense of its character, how you approach the campus, and point you to one of the first publications, if you know Scape, number 15, that documented it and also situated it within a constellation of land labs throughout Europe. And the photos that I'll be showing are of this small area that I visited over the course of a couple of hours. And I'll show you these without really any commentary. Okay, maybe one comment. On the right, you are looking at a linden grove where I'll say a quarter of the lindens were coppiced. That's a linden shrub layer. It's unbelievable. Roland Gustafsson is quite an extraordinary person. Big team has worked with him, but he's been with the Land Lab since the late 70s. He was the son of a forester, and he came to appreciate the one-to-one plots that foresters studied and wanted to introduce that within a landscape architectural program. He saw it as a place of experimentation where not only scholars could interact across discipline, but scholars could understand what we would now call the agency of plants, and would open up the research agenda to community members. There are 2 satellite land labs outside of Alnarp, and particularly one of them in a suburban context. There are places where the community has altered and changed the landscape. For those who'd like to know more about this remarkable place, I encourage you to see the new book, Woods Go Urban, that came out last year. A book review of that should be in Landscape Architecture magazine, written by me in a couple of weeks. And it is an incredible record of 40 years of work, not only planting and altering these plants, but thinking about how to actually record them systematically with profile diagrams. Roland himself has drawn over 200 of them. To think about the role of the profile diagrams in documenting the shape and the growth of trees in relationship to each other, not just the way we see them in a nursery. and to create an array of spatial typologies of woods based on spacing, species, and their juxtapositions. And this is just one of his drawings, and I've got images of his drawings from JOLA because they scan a little bit better than the ones in the thick book. And this is also a beautiful article in JOLA about the value of slow knowledge that comes from drawing. And I'll ask you to look at, let's say, 1984, and that grayish tone, because he's marking where trees declined from the previous drawing. And then you start to see how the regeneration and the plant growth changes because of not only the growth, but the loss of trees. The second part of the book sets out a series of techniques in creative management and really defines management as a design practice and thinks about design occurring not just in the studio, but after the fact in the field, and talks about work that happens in the field as being a prompt for new kinds of design tactics. In addition, there's a section on horticultural focus and a real advocacy for the importance of knowing plants so that you can experiment and not control. That issue of creative management includes experiments in perception. Some of the clearings are to see how plants grow differently in sun versus shade, but others are to create moments within the center or the edges of glades. And then the final part is really about the co-curation and the co-creation of urban woods, especially in the satellite land labs, and what it means to have a certain bit of humility and to not always be in the driver's seat when it comes to design. So this journal, this book, this experience with the Swedish Land Lab really has gotten me to think, how can we build on the 40 years of knowledge that are recorded in that book? The appendices and the scientific studies that have come out of this are quite remarkable. And how can we see some continuity between that and these much smaller, newer land labs that young faculty are leading in universities like University of Oregon, Auburn, and Ohio State. And so I just encourage those of you who would like to know a bit more about these to realize that Michael and David and Katie are all publishing and are also on social media. And you can begin to track how they and their students are exploring maintenance as a design issue, focusing on the aesthetics of thrift, and reveling in plants as a medium. And it's very easy to see, I think, a lot of Julie Bargman as well as Julian Raxworthy influence in their work. If I were to summarize Julian's influence as a visiting faculty member, and then later through his book, Overgrown, on these land labs, I would just underscore his interests in the limits of representation and his advocacy of understanding the veritic, right, the actual tectonic of plants, as including both form and process, as well as biology and aesthetics. His joy in learning in the field and understanding that maintenance that works with plant growth is explicitly a creative practice. And so Michael's working on a relatively public space that's along the river and has turned mowing into an unbelievable and rigorous exercise in parametrics, where he is establishing a replicability of his work and a rigor based on the tools and the tool paths of mowing and the way in which that mowing propagates different plant communities and assemblages. David Hill and Emily Knox, his collaborator, are very interested in the southeastern meadow landscape and the role of fire in beginning to bring that back. And they've not only won ASLA honor awards for their work, but David was just named one of the emerging voices through the New York Architectural League. And then Katie brings an artist's perspective, walking as a way of knowing, and the body as well as analog and digital implements as a way of recording that experience. So Michael Geffel, David Hill, Katie Jenkins, in the last 5 years have started these small land labs across the United States, supplementing technical and studio teaching at their institutions. We have a similar land lab at UVA on a 172-acre site that's just a few miles from Morven, but we don't have kind of long-term control of it. So the work that Matthew Siebert and Brad Cantrell and Brian Davis have been doing there with students is almost a proof of concept for some of the things that we want to do at Morven in terms of having a transect from high to low, to data sense, record and observe, to have a place for prescribed burns and the regeneration of endangered Piedmont habitats. The other thing we're doing out at Milton, which I don't have images of, is actually using it as a quasi-construction site where the students are actually working with small earth-moving equipment to understand grading and earthwork. And one of the really fantastic things about Matthew's work at Milton is that he took it on right at the beginning of the pandemic, and it allowed our students to be learning in the field during a period that we all know was quite isolating. And so I'm just showing you a couple of the studio projects that included drawing and speculating, but also working in the field. And from Rebecca Hinch to Lizzie Needham to Hannah Brown, Theodore Eichmann, they were all essentially setting the conditions for techniques and protocols that could be used in a future land lab if given a little bit more security to the site. When I say security, this site's also used for car testing by the engineering school and a lot of other just random things, so we don't really want a long-term. It's been great for the short term, and it's given us an amazing sense of what we can do at Morven. I think one of the things to keep in mind as we look at the work at Morven is that that work is collaborative in terms of designers and the staff of the Center for Urban Habitats that includes conservation biologists, anthropologists, and ethnobotanists. But our aspirations for Morven are much more transdisciplinary than that. So let me just kind of get on to Morven as a sustainability lab and why I'm describing my work there as a form of unsettling sustainability. When I applied for the job, there was a description of what the lab would be, and it included things like the university will support a broad range of education, experimentation, innovation, research, in support of the university's strategic commitment to environmental resilience and sustainability. As Gary mentioned, sustainability is not just about the environment, it's always been about social equity and economic prosperity, so it seemed to me a little narrow. The second, resources permitting, Morven can continue to support other programs such as historical legacy issues, in parentheses, enslaved and Monacan peoples. So I wrote a letter that said that would have been an interesting mission in the 1990s, but not so much today. And I'd be interested in interviewing if you let me actually alter the mission, and to think about Morven not as a lab for scientific research alone, but to recognize its role in this larger cultural landscape that we know as the Southwest Mountains. So I talked in my interview about the scope being too narrow, that history had to be key, that sustainability had to recognize the uncertainty of climate change, and that Morven had to be understood as not a blank slate. Its first name, when it became part of the Carter Plantation in 1730, was Dick's Plantation. He was the overseer, probably a person of color. And its second name was Indian Camp, because colonial maps in Virginia, in addition to showing trees and streams and other valuable areas, would say if there'd been an Indian garden or an Indian field or an Indian camp on the site. And any white settler knew that that's where the good soil was, that's where the land had already been cleared for forest farming or foraging, and those were the valuable sites to purchase and to settle. This will give you a sense of the place that, for some reason, that interviewing committee decided to let me lead. And hopefully this will help orient you as I talk through some of the programs that we're in the midst of really dreaming about. We will be done with our strategic plan in June. We've spent over a year with a listening tour, talking to people all over the university and the community. And by community, I mean groups like the Black Farmers Alliance, food justice groups like Cultivate Charlottesville, descendants of the enslaved community. And I just 2 weeks ago sent a letter to the tribal leaders of the Monacan Nation. I had to get a lot of permissions to represent UVA to a sovereign nation. So a lot of interesting diplomatic work that I've learned about. So as we've been listening, we've been trying to align the desires and the interests and the knowledge of those outside the university with inside, and to pair it with the incredible diversity of this landscape, which is half in Catoctin geology and half in Loudoun, has very different soil types. The better agricultural land is on the west side of 795, and the pine are in the shale on the other side. You know, I mentioned being critical of the way UVA was describing sustainability, and I want to be clear, I have great admiration for the institution's commitment to environmental sustainability. It's really quite remarkable. But it did seem to me to be a bit myopic of the things that I know as a landscape architect who reads sites as being full and who understands a cultural landscape approach as inevitably including the social as well as the biophysical. So just three aspects of this critique of this kind of overall set of things that the task force was hoping that we would do. Pass through this because we've already talked a little bit about that. That's the university. Okay. So first and foremost, when I think about Morven in relationship to Monticello and to Charlottesville and the university, I see it through a lens that Olaf and Worf has described as a racialized topography. The entire Charlottesville landscape was a series of plantations. You cannot avoid reading them even today. Every neighborhood, shopping center, you name it. Key West, it's a neighborhood. That was the name of a plantation. Penn Park, Stonefield, Belmont. So descendants of the enslaved who still live in Charlottesville, that racialized topography permeates so much of how They think about the city and the county, who lives on the highland, who has access to the highland, who doesn't. And so history, from our perspective, is entwined with sustainability, with access to arable land. All the free black farms after the Civil War were in that shaly, crummy soil. That's where the land that they were given to buy. So that legacy endures hundreds of years after emancipation. This is not just a mapping exercise. The relationship between UVA, Monticello, which is the mount, the low mount just to the right of the gap, and Morven is just, if you roll over the ridge behind Monticello, that's Morven. These landscapes are within each other's view sheds. Faculty at UVA, the Smith family owned Morven. Their son lived on the lawn for 60 years. One of the Smiths' father-in-laws also lived on the lawn and taught there. He ran the anatomical theater, which meant he was responsible for sourcing cadavers, usually from cemeteries and often black cemeteries. So there's not just this kind of larger racialized topography, but very specific entwinements of black and white people, free and enslaved people, UVA and Morven descendants. I mentioned that kind of legacy of where do you get to buy land, and this is interpretive collage that Chris Porter created. The purple are the free black parcels that were listed on the Albemarle County 1940 deed records. And they're all in the lowlands adjacent to many of the plantations where emancipated people bought land in the 19th century. And the final thing I'll mention in terms of this recognition of Morven as a racialized topography is, given the work at UVA on the President's Commissions on Slavery and Segregation that go back almost 10 years now, the research on the over 5,000 enslaved people who lived and worked on the UVA grounds up through 1865, and the recent opening of the memorial to the enslaved laborers, not acknowledging that Morven's 2,900 acres had value because of the intelligence, ingenuity, labor, love of all the people who lived and worked on that land, besides the white landowners, just seemed unethical. So I've come to think about sustainability differently through this lens, that maybe we should talk about it as policies, practices, and technologies that recognize the cultural practices and land management practices of the past, question the needs of the present, not, kind of sustain our current needs, and assure the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. The second critique really builds on my interest in aesthetics and adding affectivity and aesthetics to a sustainability agenda. There is so much new literature in the environmental humanities on climate grief, eco-anxiety, the transformative power of awe and wonder during nature experience, that we want to make sure that all UVA students are out to Morven, regardless of the research and the classes that they're taking. And here, one of the members of our strategic planning group, Anil Chima, introduced me to his Stanford colleague, Dr. Keltner's relatively recent book on awe. And all the things that awe does, besides potentially alter us, it opens us up to the strengths and virtues of other people, to the unknown. And this book is based on 25 years of scientific research, neuroscience, environmental psychology, on the influence of awe. There's one chapter on awe in nature. There's others on spiritual aspects of awe, the awe of going to a rock concert or mosh pit. I mean, it's a great book. So we're thinking about what does it mean to sustain and regenerate our students? How can they be climate citizens and warriors if they're grieving, if they're anxious? So that's a second really important component of the work. And it is complicated by the fact that some of the spaces that evoke awe are also spaces that have deep histories. We're looking in that panorama towards what's called the Ancient Road, an amazing trail, thousands of years old. Last quote that I want to share with you is that awe may make us more curious, creative, and compassionate, feel connected to others, and identify with categories such as an inhabitant of the earth as opposed to individualist ones. And I was alluding to a lot of this in Seized by Sublime Sentiments in the Post-Earth Day conundrum, but I really didn't have the research to back up a lot of the speculation. And so these writings have allowed us to think about access to Morven, building on one meditative space that exists there. John and Tussie Kluge in the mid-1990s brought this incredible crew of Japanese garden designers to Morven. They were into meditation back then. And a lot of community members have come here not simply to enjoy the garden for its aesthetic experience, but to deal with grieving and trauma. And as you can imagine, in the last 7 years in Charlottesville, we've had a boatload of that. So this component is really exciting to us, of seeing the kernel of what's been going on with meditation in the Japanese garden, intersecting with so many new texts on our emotions and climate change, and how we can think about the experiential aspects of Morven. I mentioned that this awe is often associated not just with wonder, but with dread and fear. And this particular photograph that someone shared with me really speaks to this, and it's something I'm asking everyone I talk to about: how do we deal with this? Because if you approach this photograph without knowledge of the place, it evokes something very different than if you know that the area to the left of the barn where the rainbow is pointing, we know from oral history of one of the Thackers who worked at Morven that there was an enslaved cemetery there that was destroyed during the construction of another barn. And we also know that the valley right in front of that slight berm is the beginning of Indian Creek. That space is no longer after this year, but has been sprayed with Roundup by a farmer who leases the land for the last 25 years. So we've got to be really careful about green being potentially a mask to the thick history of this place, and we're very interested in how to interpret these experiences so that they resonate with a diverse public. And then the third critique, it deals with what does sustainability have to offer in an era of climate change. And here I'll just share with you a couple of ways that we're trying to think about Morven in particular. One is how this place-based specific site can begin to suggest ways of and models of rural land management in the Piedmont, an area which is relatively stable in terms of temperature change because of 100 years of reforestation, but has incredible stresses because of variations in rainfall. We've had a lot of floods, same amount of annual rain, but not in the same way. We've had all the problems of air quality that you all experienced last summer. We felt them. The air quality was 160, the index in Charlottesville. And maybe most specifically, because it's pretty clear from historic records that Morven was deforested by the early 1920s, there's an incredible amount of soil erosion, riparian corridor degradation. The archaeologists had to go through 3 to 6 feet of transposed topsoil to get to what had been the ground in the 1780s. And I want to not speak to this, but just so that it's on record and folks can look at it later, an amazing team of people working with me, engineers, historians, religion, psychology, architectural history, NVISI, faculty and staff. And I also want to share with you, and again, not to go over it, these kind of draft mission where we're talking about Morven is place-based, transdisciplinary, including community knowledge and being experiential and experimental. We are quite clear about the ethical understanding of this place that acknowledges ancestral land practices. And we are not only interested in historical research, but the co-creation and co-curation of programs and plans for Morven that are controlled by and determined by people outside the UVA community. So we're bringing a cultural landscape approach, a climate justice approach, a decolonizing sustainability approach to the work that we're going to do at Morven. So what I'd like to do in the next part of the talk is just give you a sense of the scales that we're working at. I'm going to start with the really big scale. So UVA doesn't actually own this land. Our foundation does. I won't go into how that works, but all the big chunks of land that UVA owns outside Central Grounds are owned by a foundation. And I think they thought I was going to come and ask for 50 acres. And I said, nope, 2,900, that's the land lab, and then we'll have things within that. So we're going to be at the table with changing the woodland management and regeneration plans, working with the state forester as well as with indigenous tribes that are interested in access to land. The tribes in Virginia were not recognized until 1989, so that many of them don't have reservations. We're also going to then be rethinking the maintenance of the historic garden around the old plantation house and working with our kitchen garden director, who's going to be shifting towards helping to lead the regenerative farming program. And to give you a sense of like these kind of array of scales that we're working at, from the historic core out to the larger landscape. So again, to orient you, the historic core is in the light, highish part of the site by Morven Drive that's curving. The pine are to the left, and then the hardwood forest up on the hill, and the farm area in the center. So when we submit the strategic plan in June, we'll start a series of subplans for regenerative farming, forestry, bringing that together into an agroforestry plan, a series of plans trying to understand how we can optimize the reuse of the 44 buildings on the site, which include about 10 residences and a lot of amazing barns built by millionaires. The Stones, who built and restored Morven from the 1920s to 1988. They owned Stone & Webster, which many of you know, one of the largest engineering firms in the United States that built the first nuclear reactor, Oak Ridge, Tennessee, for the Manhattan Project. So there's unbelievable beauty in the buildings that otherwise might not be perceived to be actually substantial. The array of plans that we're about to take on that include adaptive reuse, management, interpretation, getting a sense of some of the buildings on the site. Net Hoyt Flanders Garden, that's on the site of a 19-teens garden, that's on the site of the plantation garden. The entire landscape right now is maintained as if Mr. Kluge, the last billionaire who lived there, was still there. It's bush hogged, it's rounded up, it's really unnerving. The agricultural fields, again, look nice until you see them rounded up. And many of you know that 10% of our annual greenhouse gases in the United States come from poor agricultural practices, 33% globally. So we have incredible opportunity to be part of an alternative agroforestry initiative. That was the day after they rounded up. I know. So on lands that are currently in hay and corn production or bush hog, we'll be developing a new mosaic with, I hope, a farm incubator. We're not an ag school. That's just not our thing. And so we're actually interested in providing access to land to the Black Farmers Alliance and other minority groups in the region that are interested in farming but don't have land access. And this is allowing us to think about the future of that site and its agricultural practices in relationship to what we know about some of the past practices. And this is actually a 1940s overlay of the old pasture lands and in comparison to contemporary ag sites, the best agricultural soils. And these were an overlay of the 1790s tenant farms and their relationship to what we know about the best soils. Okay, here's that mosaic as it exists today of those ag lands. I want to say a couple things about the forestry work. I mentioned we have an exciting opportunity to work with the State Department of Forestry to rethink how the pine is managed. It probably should have been timbered 15 years ago, so it's going to be an extraordinary opportunity. We've got contacts with, I can't believe this actually still happens. There are horse timbering operations that aren't doing mass timbering that we're considering. We want to think about what climate change is going to be doing to the hardwood forest. The oaks are endangered in our region, and the forests, having already lost the chestnut, are shifting towards monocultures of red maple. And so those pine forests, they're scrappy. The hardwood forests are struggling, although they do have a very healthy pawpaw understory because the deer eat everything else. And then within that big matrix, we hope to be working with Devin Floyd, who's been working with us at Milton, to locate and preserve and propagate some of the remnant Piedmont savanna landscape that hasn't been cultivated extensively because of rocky soils and tough situations like that. Within the research management of the larger landscape that Manuel Lerdo will be working with me on, we'll have a series of opportunities for UVA courses. We have about 10 classes at Morven right now, and they range from ecoacoustics to soil science and architectural history fieldwork. Maybe 10 years down the road, we'll be opening up to possibilities with local schools, but we realize the strategic plan has got to unfold over time. And I want to show you where some of that outreach could start and some of the learning, the classroom learning has started, and that's in the kitchen garden that was started by UVA students, funded the whole thing 2 years ago. And it's allowed students in a liberal arts university to think about sustainability through something tangible, food, and for food to be food production, food scarcity, food equity, for this to be a way in which they engage with some of the policy and planning issues they learn in other classes. Manuel's been teaching an agroforestry class for a couple of years, and he's been bringing in students in the sciences in conversation with policy students. And it's helping them to realize that not everything needs to be fixed in terms of automobile transportation or solar energy, that there's actually a landscape and a nature-based infrastructure solution to some of our carbon problems. Within that big landscape, we are going to have some small land labs like the ones that we've looked at to date, and this will be one of the models for us. But we've got a couple already ongoing. Michael Lugering has a $4.5 million nature-based infrastructure grant with the the Corps of Engineers. He's on the landscape architecture faculty, and he's been doing a proof of concept planting. It's hard to explain, but let's just say this has essentially helped him prove that mowing Spartina is going to be a more effective way to get marsh grass to move in the Chesapeake Bay on the coast than leaving it alone. So very interesting little project. Jenny Rowe is talking about the development of an environmental psychology lab at Morven, where students can not only enjoy the place, but potentially be part of a research project. We just hired Megan Bloomstein to join the environmental science faculty. She got her PhD here and is doing her postdoc at MIT, and she's getting 30 acres for a tree common garden, and she and her husband are also going to live at Morven. So we're thrilled with the kind of interest. Katie and Kyle and the architecture faculty, Katie McDonald and Kyle Schumann, have a $25,000 fancy CNC routing thing that I can't explain, but it works parametrically with irregular trunks of trees, so there's not scrap wood. And they are thrilled about potentially working in one of the barns and having a kind of home for their research. The last thing I want to mention really relates to this kind of broader lab that is going to take a long time to develop and probably will be done less through consultants, but through a combination of consultants and faculty and students. And it's a series of land labs related to the history of the site. There has been a little bit of work done to date by incredible scholars Scott French and Lenora McQueen, primarily on the social history of the site. Lenora is a descendant of an enslaved person at Morven, and she is an amazing self-taught historian. She's a studio art teacher in San Antonio. And so we're able to build on 20 years of her work, 10 years of Scott's, and fingers crossed, Lenora will become our first community historian. She and Scott are in the process of drafting a book proposal. So their work allows us to understand the history of this place, not only in terms of the impact and the intentions of the designer or the will of the owners, but through a broader social history. We know a lot about a few of the buildings, but it's quite remarkable that last year when I walked around and said, hey, what about those terraces? Nobody had noticed that there's terraces by the house and that the landscape is an archive. Those are the old plantation terraces. We found photographs that show a very different place in transformation in the early 20th century in emancipated people still living in the house where 53 people were sold in 1853. Some of them, their ancestors. Lenora's last relative worked at Morven in 2000. We're understanding that the production of food was close to the house, much closer than it is now, and that The garden before the current garden, also on the scaffold of the plantation garden, designed in the teens by Josephine Marshall, a Wisconsin woman, and her husband bought Morven, like a lot of Northerners bought these fallow plantations in the early 20th century. She describes designing this with a man named Uncle Lewis. And when I showed this to Thaisa Way, she said, I've been working with some people doing work on the Negro garden clubs in Virginia, and this looks like one of the best vernacular African-American gardens of the region. So there's histories that we don't know, and laborers who are just starting to understand all of whose histories we want to build on and appreciate. We have 100 years of farm journals to work with, so our archive is scattered, and that's another project, just cataloging this. Daily records of temperature, planting, and actually because Annette Hoyt Flanders started the garden in the 1930s, all the work related to the garden. So I've had one student work for one summer to transcribe one journal, so hopefully we'll figure out some AI version of that to speed the process up. In the attics, we've found plane table surveys and a lot of PR to try to persuade and snooker people to buy degraded farms in Virginia in the early 20th century. So we're trying to understand this larger agricultural history. And then, frankly, also just reconnoitering through the property and talking to the current staff who know stories, like this is the valley where the enslaved cemetery was, and it's also the site of a former ravine that was apparently filled with construction rubble, which I assume are all the enslaved dwellings and outbuildings that were demolished in the 1920s. We're learning about streams like this that ecology faculty and students are interested in developing ecological restoration proposals for, but because they're called Lee Jones Run, this creek, and we know Lee Jones was a colored man in 1940 who owned land on this creek, we also realize we have more archaeology to do before that scientific work happens. And this leads me just to the obvious thing for a landscape architect, but not so obvious for the archaeologists and historians, hydrologists and foresters who are interested in working on this site, is the landscape is multivalent, and that a landscape architect leading a project like this has the spatial capacity and literacy to begin to cite and adjudicate where these various things might happen. I keep these two images in here to remind me of all the history that hasn't been written versus the history that has, this little 1930s garden, which is the reason that this site is on the Virginia Garden Week Historic Garden Tour every year. There's so much more to the site than that. Lastly, with this history lab, we want to think about Morven in relationship to this larger landscape. And Ashlawn Highland is President Monroe's property, Monticello, obviously Jefferson, Montpelier, Madison's. So there's almost 200,000 acres of rural historic district and a real desire to try to understand this landscape in relationship to that broader social and political history. So that history lab is the one that I think you can tell my heart is in, and the one that will set the scaffold for the land use plans that we do based on the forestry, the farming, and the building plans. So I just want to conclude with a couple of what might be kind of obvious insights that I've gleaned in the last year of working with colleagues around Charlottesville and the university about Morven's potential, particularly its potential as something that's site-specific, but also dealing with the issues that are affecting our region relative to a changing climate. I think place matters for all of us because so much of the conversation about climate change is top-down, dealing with metrics and geoengineering and systems, and is not connected to specific local and regional conditions where we know a lot of innovation can happen. I mean, there's a reason why urban forest plans are getting a lot of attention because there's innovation happening relative to specific neighborhoods and regions. The second thing I think is that we have the capacity for a different kind of research grounds at Morven. That's a commons for our community. We don't have a large regional park. In fact, all the early 20th century parks in Charlottesville were white or colored. And so there's a real baggage to all of them. I also think that this commons has the capacity to be driven by the community's interests and to be a kind of open grounds. We call our campus a grounds that is co-created and co-curated. Third, sustainability requires some speculation and imagination and not just the surety of technology. It needs to depend on effects as well as data and recognize history as well as science. There's a kind of unsettling of metrics that our mission is requiring. And as you can tell from the way in which I've mentioned colleagues, Morven allows us to read the site through a transdisciplinary lens that's both biophysical, natural, but also social and cultural. The final point, and something that's been inspiring to me, is that this is a land lab being led by someone from the design school at UVA. And it's clear that I'm understood as someone who can empathize and understand different languages related to the land, that I have the capacity because of the spatial tools that I use as a designer to find conversations between anthropologists and archaeologists, scientists, designers, lawyers, and planners. And design thinking is a valuable skill for a sustainability agenda. It's more important than I think a lot of folks realize to value our spatial literacy than to get caught up in the steps of design thinking and to realize spatial literacy as a lingua franca. That lingua franca has allowed me to look at sites like this and to realize that, yes, there's erosion, and yes, we have to stop the Roundup, but yes, it's also the beginning of Indian Creek that leads to Buck Island Creek, that leads to the Rivanna River, and the Rivanna, when it intersects the James, was where the Monacan Nation had its capital. To value the multivalent aspects of a site like this. I think unsettling sustainability by including so many voices is fundamental for dealing with climate change if we understand climate justice and concerns for eco-anxiety and climate grief to be part of what we're working with. I think it's incredibly exciting to imagine the knowledge that is going to be behind this effort to be not only that of experts, but of the community whose stories are entangled in this place. Their imagination is extraordinary, and I'm humbled by the opportunity to be able to work with them over not only the last year, but the next 4 years. Thank you.
Thank you, Beth, and congratulations on this amazing project. I would say that I wouldn't have predicted that you would be doing that, but having rehearsed just a few of the many impacts of your work across a career as a scholar and as a landscape architect, it doesn't surprise. I mean, in some ways, it's almost like a summation, but a reformulation at the same time. I love that thing, unsettling sustainability. You know, I just think about how in the 90s, I resisted using the word even because it was already pat. Right. And it was already easily applied to things that we would somehow call greenwashing. But as a practitioner, I learned gradually that our clients demanded this of us. And we've gone through, you know, some real changes, but I think you have indexed the many aspects of sustainability that are required if we're to be truly working in a sustainable way. I love the ambition of the project, the interdisciplinarity of it. It seems like at a provostial level in the university, there are not many projects that could touch on so many disciplines in the institution. I want to talk about something that you and I did earlier today. To come to your new materialist way of thinking about fascinations with management, with phenology, with biodiversity and experiments with that, and the agency of plants. Earlier today, this morning, Beth and I had a 90-minute conversation with the first-year MLA class in history that Thaisa teaches, ostensibly around a garden that was designed 70 years ago by Dan Kiley. What a great coincidence that was today, having our Kiley lecturer talk about a Kiley project for a class of 27 people. And we had great questions from the class, and one in particular related directly to what you spoke about tonight. So, you know, this was work that I did in the 90s, you did a little bit later than that. And it was a close reading of a carefully crafted and amazingly maintained landscape. And the question came up about how, you know, the living material that makes a hedge, which is only a certain dimension, is that really a way that we should design landscapes? Well, this was 70 years ago, and I'm glad that the Millers had 3 men working there every day of the year to keep it up, and that, you know, we've received this kind of very important artifact of a way of thinking spatially with plants, you know, 70 years ago. But the question was an apt question, right? And it is, so what's behind that question, I think, is what I've been hearing for 2 years from students, which is they want more contact with the landscape. They want more recognition that the landscape is not something we are in complete control of, that it's contingent. And you provided tonight, like, for me, a script about how we can do that. So I'm grateful for that. But I just like you to reflect a little bit more in a casual way now while our audience is formulating their questions about this fascination. How it's, people are even radicalized around it, around what I know some of your colleagues at UVA call regimens of care.
Well, I was thinking, and Neil, where are you?
Neil is at...
Yeah, I'm thinking about one of the first students I had a conversation with about management, like what happens after the drawings are done. And I remember that so vividly. I mean, so even before Julian and Teresa on the faculty, there's clearly just a kind of frustration with the disconnect between the creative process and then all the things that really impact the way in which a landscape evolves. So, I mean, I'm going to not answer this by answering it a different way. I see my colleagues who are teaching their students and the ones who are going out to teach, not only invigorated by what's being learned through plant knowledge and care, frankly, they're also taking care of themselves, and there's a lot of burnout in our field, so I think there's something really powerful about that. I also think that there's a lot of money for reforestation and agricultural innovations, and we haven't been tapping into it. So there's actually a different kind of funding mechanism. I mean, that being said, one thing that I want to be really clear about that I'm benefiting from, when Mr. Kluge, when John and Tussie gave Morven to UVA, and like none of you will know his name, but in the 1980s he owned some big gazillion media. I don't know. He was one of the first early billionaires, right?
Cablevision.
Yeah, whatever. Yeah, like I don't even know what it was. He gave UVA 7,000 acres and said you cannot sell 3,000. So the other 4,000, Dave Matthews, his mother, like all kinds of people in Charlottesville bought and put into conservation easements, and we have a $45 million endowment, which sounds like a lot of money, but when you have 3,000 acres and 44 buildings, it's not that much. But we do have something to start with, which I think is really important to recognize here, is that we have the capacity to dream because John and Tussie knew that something could happen on this site. And I've had the great benefit of meeting their son and his family who live nearby. To know that the kinds of things we care about, they had an organic garden. They were into meditation and well-being. They were just, like, in addition to the kind of amazingly privileged life, they were also, and particularly this is John with his fourth wife, late in life, I think understanding what really mattered to him. He, by the way, was a first-generation German immigrant, totally self-made, amazing man. Yeah.
One other thing before we open it up, I want to connect your important work on unfolding for the landscape architecture community, the sublime in the 90s, and in particular the technological sublime, with the new science of everyday wonder. Yeah. These are directly linked, right? Only we know more now about neuroscience. And so we sort of can prove what Richard Payne Knight told us in the 18th century, that this feeling you get from a landscape is something that can be transformative. You can be in awe. And you connect it with grief. Like, it has the capacity to, let's say, overcome grief, right? Climate grief. And but have you been thinking about that? Like the historic, picturesque, and sublime, which was so important in your early theory work, comes back to, I think, very common knowledge now about the importance of being in a landscape.
Yeah, I mean, this is where Anil and David have been so remarkable on our strategic planning committee. We have a Center for Contemplative Sciences that's relatively new and has faculty in medicine, religion, psychology, I mean, all over the university. And they'll be real collaborators and partners with us, as will student health. We have a head of student health who's a physician and who also teaches nature medicine, wilderness medicine. He is so awesome. He knows everything you can eat in the forest to keep you alive and what you can actually do to kill somebody, with that plant. from contemplative sciences to student health to my colleagues in environmental psychology, there is so much excitement about finding an alternative for our undergrads, besides, some kind of anxiety drug or therapy, and trying to be proactive about what it means to actually be well. And you could tell from one of those quotes, not only be well, but to actually be a community and to trust other people, particularly people who are not like you. And I don't have to tell any of you the complications on university campuses these days with free speech and trust and debates. So what's been remarkable is how, like, something that I thought, might be squeezing this into the mission, to have the whole first year class, come out during orientation and hike or camp or meditate or whatever, hang out in a hammock. I mean, if you're not into climbing 900 feet to the ridge, we'll find something less arduous to do, right? But it's been amazing to see how the research has permeated so many disciplines, and how the folks who are dealing with the undergraduates day to day see it as a game changer for us.
That's really great. I mean, there is just a lot of tension on campus, and it would be nice if we didn't have to treat that with medication. Our students have been asking for this, and so we, in response, we are kind of redesigning our preterm workshop to have more time in the Arboretum.
That's great.
Okay, one or two questions. We don't have too much time, but there's a mic. Muha has a mic. Andrew?
Thank you so much for the lecture. A lot of wonderful things to unpack in that, but something I took away from from our meeting in class this morning that I saw research here in your presentation is the role of mediation and translation. And it strikes me that the land and this project is doing that, and that the landscape architect as well is uniquely suited to that. I just was wondering if you could expand a little bit more on that role and how we're able to do that, or like what we need to accomplish that, I guess. Thank you.
So many ways I could think about this, but one that may be helpful is kind of grounding my experience in living in a place for a long time and what it means to have a community that trusts you, right? So I think to be a landscape architect, a designer is one thing, and another thing is committing to the place you live, and not just being a faculty member flying in and out, but being on community boards, serving on the faculty senate. Like, I've built a lot of relationships, and it's a very strange thing for a nomad like me to say. I think I can't remember how many times I moved before I went to college. I'm a Navy brat. I don't have that kind of example of roots. So I think one thing that's really helped is that I'm doing this in a place I've lived for 30 plus years. I think the other thing is that, and this is all like side story, but I think it's important to know. When I was on the faculty senate, our board of visitors tried to oust our president, and we fought back and won. And one of the ways we did that was through a war room that I helped run. So when I say people trust me, they've been in situations where something was really, the stakes were high, and the faculty became a faculty then. I mean, we were not connected across schools. The A school became actually part of the university at that time. So I don't want to underemphasize that. I think that's helped a lot. But I do think that when I'm in a room with Manuel, who's like such a smart plant biologist, and at the same time I'm listening to Paul, who is a political theorist who's interested in the politics of food, and Lenora McQueen, who's talking about her descendant history in this place. There are often conflicts, and if I'm not able to actually talk about those, not in terms of disciplinary issues or priorities, but if I can begin to actually cite them in relationship to each other, see their connections or disconnections, it just, it gets you out of thinking about the people you're talking to as stakeholders. I really hate that term. I'm here and I'm not going to move. But actually, to understand that we all have a relationship to this place, and some of those relationships are fixed and really matter. It's got to be right here. But others are, maybe more field conditions or flows across a space or have a temporal component. So I think you can use a lot of spatial metaphors that we use, right, to begin to negotiate and translate and mediate between these different interests. I don't know if that answers your question.
Thanks, Andrew. Any other questions?
Thank you. So Beth, I remember you said back at UVA, there's a phrase you told me that is, don't put lipsticks on a pig. That was referring to kind of like a lot of us are trying to use some magical Photoshop tricks to, like put beautiful trees or flowers where we want to hide the things that we haven't figured out how to design that. And then today you said again a kind of that similar phrase that is, green could be the mask of the local history. I was just wondering, so what would be the role of landscape architecture to do in this kind of situation? Are we trying to like unveil or?
Yeah, the 20th century owners of Morven, really remarkably successful people, they totally erased the 19th century. And this happens in a lot of Virginia estates where a landscape of leisure replaced a landscape that was built and maintained by enslaved labor. So it's not just Morven, it's a lot of the rural landscape of Virginia. And I think there's a couple things, and it's fun seeing Garnett here because we're going to go for a little walk and talk tomorrow. But we've been talking a lot about walking at Morven and the way in which walks can kind of upend some of the erasure that's happened, because there's totally different ways of reconnoitering, right? Like thinking of Indian Creek, the way a native person thought about it, that was their road. The roads were the creeks and the rivers, not the ridges, right? And beginning to connect some of the sites like Lee Jones Run. It's super close to where the Japanese garden was. And we just saw a reference that there was a wild garden there in the 1930s. So I actually think that was probably not very different from what was going on at Monticello. There were sneaky ways from the big house to the property boundary where enslaved people on weekends, on Sundays, weren't working, and there was a social space. So we want to actually choreograph a lot of walks that are interpreting letters and oral histories that we've heard, just to get out of the choreography of the big house and its relationship to the landscape. But I also think simply the lack of bush hogging and the restoration of a grassland ecology in a big part of that site is going to do a lot to reduce the segmentation of the valleys, which are so structured through industrial agriculture right now. There's a lot more that I could say about this, but it is going to be necessary because there are a lot of minority students at UVA who feel uncomfortable at Morven. And I'm not just talking about African Americans, I'm talking about our international students who don't have, as you know, like the history of Virginia and its racial history. Like, it takes a lot to wrap your head around that. So we know it's a really big issue, how we interpret the place, how we walk through the site, and how we begin to get rid of this kind of suburban green veneer and have a more complex mosaic.
That's great. Okay, we're going to end there, I want to just say that we all anticipated that Beth's retirement from teaching was a massive loss for the field and especially for the University of Virginia. But actually, it's a gain. Because this is like Harvard hiring Charles Sprague Sargent, who made those incredible maps of the entire forests of North America in 1884. How do you even think of doing that? What you're up to is, to me, potentially that powerful. Thank you.